The blood trickled between my fingers as I stared at what I had done. The walls of our small apartment, ash gray like the days of my existence, were now painted red. My mother, Veronica, lay on the kitchen floor, her empty eyes staring at me as they always had, without really seeing me. For the first time in 17 years, I felt peace. For the first time, the silence didn't hurt. You may judge me, call me a monster, but before you decide who I am, you need to understand what brought me here. You need to know the real monster of this story. My name is Matthew. I'm 19 now. I spent the last 2 years in a juvenile rehabilitation center after what I did to my family. You've probably heard about my case on the local news. Teenager kills mother and uncles in fit of rage. That's how they described it. But headlines never tell the complete story, never show what exists behind the actions. They only show the end, the result, the blood. I'm sitting in an empty park as I tell this story. The sun is starting to set, and the shadows are lengthening, like the years of my life before that day. I left the center 3 months ago. I have a job now, a small apartment, a chance to start over, but the memories won't leave me. They never will. When I was 17, I took a knife from the kitchen and took the life of my mother, Veronica, and my 2 uncles, Richard and Philip. 3 people who should have been my family. 3 people who turned my existence into a silent hell from the day I was born. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, not even to justify what I did. I'm here to tell the truth, all of it, unfiltered. Because even in the worst acts, there's a human story behind them. And mine begins even before my birth, on a night when violence created more violence, in a cycle I tried to break in the only way I knew how. If you're really paying attention to me, if you really want to understand what could lead a son to do what I did, I need you to like this video right now. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. This is important to me because I need to know I'm not talking to myself again like I did throughout my entire life. I need to know someone is truly listening for the first time. Maybe you're thinking I'm just another troubled teen who couldn't handle his own feelings. Maybe you think I'm a heartless psychopath who always wanted to kill. None of that is true. I desperately loved my mother. I spent my entire life trying to make her love me back, trying to make her simply see me. And when I understood that would never happen, when I discovered the truth about my birth, something inside me broke in a way that couldn't be fixed. My story doesn't begin with blood, but with silence. A silence that screamed louder than any words ever could. A silence that eventually consumed me from within, until nothing remained but emptiness and anger and the need to make that silence stop once and for all. What would you do if you discovered that your very existence is the result of an act of violence so brutal it destroyed the person who should love you? What would you do if you understood that for your mother, each time she looked at you, she relived the worst moment of her life? How would you react upon realizing you were never a son, but just a constant reminder of unbearable pain? Stay with me, and I'll show you how emotional abandonment can kill the soul long before anyone decides to kill a body. I'll show you how I became the monster everyone says I am. I was born in a small apartment in the projects, a 3-room place where the sun barely entered through the narrow windows, as if even light was afraid to witness what happened inside. I don't have many memories of my first years. What they told me later is that my mother, Veronica, hardly touched me when I was a baby. She fed me, changed me, did the basics to keep me alive. But without that contact every baby needs. My first clear memory is from when I was about 4 years old. I'm sitting on the living room floor, playing alone with some wooden blocks the neighbor had given me. My mother is sitting in the only armchair in the house, looking out the window. I remember getting up, going to her, and trying to climb onto her lap. She didn't yell, didn't push me away. She simply went rigid like a statue. Her eyes, always distant, became even emptier. After a few seconds, she put me back on the floor and went to the bedroom, closing the door. That was the first time I felt that pain in my chest, that feeling of being invisible to the only person who should see me. We lived alone at that time. My mother worked as a house cleaner for wealthy families, leaving early and coming back late. A neighbor, Mrs. Clara, took care of me during the day. It was with her that I learned to speak properly, to eat with a fork and knife, to tie my shoes. It was from her that I received the first hugs I remember. Sometimes I think that if Mrs. Clara hadn't moved away when I was 6, maybe my story would have been different. When she left, the real isolation began. I stayed alone at home while my mother worked. She would leave food prepared, tell me not to open the door for anyone, and leave. A 6-year-old boy completely alone for hours on end. I learned to deal with fear, with loneliness. I learned to talk to the walls so I wouldn't go crazy. Things changed when I was 8. My uncles, Richard and Philip, came to live with us. They were my mother's brothers who had spent time in prison for crimes I would only understand years later. The small apartment became even smaller, the silence even heavier. Richard was the oldest, a big man with rough hands and bloodshot eyes. He drank a lot and spoke little. Philip was different, thin, nervous, always moving as if he had ants under his skin. The two treated my mother with a strange mixture of contempt and protection, as if she were both a burden and a responsibility. As for me, I was the ghost of the house, the boy they pretended not to see, except when they needed someone to blame for something. A broken glass, a high electricity bill, a bad day at work. Everything was a reason for angry looks and harsh words directed at me. "Why did you have to be born?" I heard my Uncle Richard mutter one night after several bottles of beer, thinking I was already asleep. "Her life ended because of you, kid." It was the first clue I had about the mystery of my existence, about why my mother could barely look at me. At school, I was the quiet boy in the back of the class. I had no friends, didn't participate in games. The teachers thought I was introspective. Some tried to approach, ask if everything was okay at home. I always said yes. What could I say? That my mother fed and dressed me but never hugged me? That my uncles looked at me as if I were a mistake? That I felt there was something wrong with me? Something so terrible that made my own family unable to love me? One teacher in particular, Ms. Denise, noticed the bruises on my arm when I was 10, marks from Uncle Philip's fingers after I accidentally broke the photo frame with my grandmother's picture. She called Child Protective Services. Social workers came to our house. For the first time, my mother hugged me in front of them, smiled, said I was her precious boy, all a big act. When they left, the real hell began. "You want to separate us? Is that it?" my mother asked, her voice fuller of emotion than I had ever heard. But it was anger, not love. "Want to end the little I've built? Isn't everything you've already taken from me enough?" That night I slept in the backyard. Nobody came looking for me. As I grew up, the family dynamics became clearer to me. My mother lived in her own world of pain, rarely present even when she was physically there. My uncles were her reluctant guardians, as if they were serving a penance or paying a debt by taking care of her, and by extension tolerating my presence. At 12, I began to create strategies to survive. I spent as much time as possible away from home. I went to school early, came back late, stayed at the public library on weekends. I learned to become even more invisible when I was at home, moving silently, occupying as little space as possible, avoiding eye contact. I developed a rich inner world where I was loved, where I mattered. I read any book I could find. I lost myself in stories where the protagonists overcame terrible circumstances and found their place in the world. I hoped that one day this would happen to me too. Puberty brought new layers of confusion. My body was changing, my voice deepening, and I began to look more and more like someone. I noticed how my mother avoided looking at me even more during this period, as if my face was transforming into something unbearable for her. Once I caught her looking at me with tears in her eyes. It was the only time I saw my mother cry. When she realized I was watching her, her face hardened again, and she simply left the room. I stood there, feeling that there was something fundamentally wrong with me, something so terrible that made the people who should love me feel only pain when they saw me. Lying on the thin mattress in the corner of the bedroom I shared with my uncles, I wondered about my father. My mother never, not once, mentioned who he was or what had happened to him. When I was younger and naive, I actually asked. The result was a slap in the face and a week of absolute silence, as if I had committed the worst of sins. I grew up believing that my father had been some boyfriend who abandoned my mother when she got pregnant, that maybe I looked like him, and that's why she couldn't bear to look at me. It was the only explanation that made sense to me at that moment. I had no idea how much worse the truth would be, how it would destroy the little humanity that still remained in me. At 14, I began to change. The silence and rejection that used to make me shrink and try to disappear began to feed something different inside me. Anger. An anger that grew with each avoided look, each ignored birthday, each night spent listening to my uncles talk about me as if I were a burden, a curse. It was at this time that I had my first fight at school. A boy named Brian made some comment about me not having a father. I broke his nose with a chair. I was suspended for 2 weeks. At home, nobody said anything. It was as if they hadn't even noticed I was there all day, for days on end. The violence brought a strange sense of power. For the first time, someone had reacted to me, had seen me. Even if it was fear, what I saw in Brian's eyes was something. It was better than the emptiness I found at home. I began to look for this kind of recognition elsewhere. Small acts of vandalism, shoplifting. Nothing serious, just enough to feel that adrenaline, that feeling of existing, of mattering, even if in a negative way. At 15, I met Dylan. He was 18, had already been through the juvenile system, and lived alone in a run-down apartment in the same neighborhood as me. Dylan sold drugs, but more than that, he offered me something I'd never had before. Attention. He listened to me, laughed at my jokes, taught me how to defend myself, treated me like a younger brother. For a while, I found in him the family I never had. I started sleeping at his place more than at home. Nobody noticed my absence, or if they did, they didn't care. It was Dylan who introduced me to drugs. First marijuana, then harder stuff. I didn't use them to have fun like the other kids. I used them to numb the pain, to silence the voices in my head that incessantly repeated that something was wrong with me, something fundamentally defective that made me impossible to love. One day I returned home after nearly a week away. I was under the effect of something Dylan had given me, kind of groggy, but I needed to get clean clothes. The house was quiet, as always. I entered my room and started gathering some things in a backpack. That's when I heard voices coming from the kitchen. My mother and my uncles speaking softly, but with an intensity they rarely showed. He's becoming just like him, Veronica. The same look, the same gestures. It's like seeing a ghost, Uncle Richard was saying. Shut up. My mother's voice sounded tense, broken. I don't want to talk about this. We need to talk. The kid is following the same path. Drugs, violence. It's his blood speaking louder, Richard continued. I told you to get an abortion, Uncle Philip's voice always harsher. Told you nothing good would come from carrying that monster's child, but you wanted to play the saint. How could I know? My mother's voice rose, breaking into sobs. How could I know that looking at him would be like reliving that night every day? How could I imagine he would be so much like him? I was paralyzed. The words entered my mind like blades, cutting through all the assumptions I had made about my origin. It's been 16 years, Veronica. 16 years since those 3 men attacked you, and you still haven't gotten over it, Philip continued, his voice mixing anger and what might have been pity. We raised the boy as you wanted. We stayed around, but he's not our blood. He's their blood. He's not at fault, my mother responded, her voice almost vanishing. I know he's not to blame, but every time I look at him, every time I see those eyes, it's like being in that alley again, feeling them. She couldn't finish. I heard a muffled sob. Then silence. I was shaking. My entire body seemed made of ice. The pieces of the puzzle of my existence finally fit together, forming a more horrible picture than I could ever have imagined. I wasn't the son of a boyfriend who abandoned my mother. I was the result of a rape, a gang rape. And worse, I resembled one of the rapists. Every day of my life, my mother had been forced to look at the face of her attacker, reflected in her own son. I left the house that night without anyone seeing me. I went back to Dylan's apartment and used everything he had available to try to erase that revelation from my mind, to try to numb myself from a truth that was too painful to bear. I spent weeks in this almost catatonic state. Dylan asked what had happened, but I couldn't speak. How do you explain that your very existence is the fruit of an act of violence so brutal? How do you process that the horror in your mother's eyes was not your fault, but not her fault either? Deep down, something was changing inside me. The anger, which before was diffuse, now found specific targets. My mother, who never managed to separate the crime from the child. My uncles, who saw me as an aberration, bad blood, and the unknown men who had planted the seed of my existence through an unforgivable act of violence. I began having nightmares. I dreamed of faceless men chasing me, shouting that I was just like them, that evil was in my blood, that I was destined to repeat their acts. I would wake up soaked in sweat, screaming. At 16, I returned home. Not out of longing or reconciliation, but because Dylan was arrested and I had nowhere else to go. The family dynamic remained the same. Silence, avoidance, barely disguised contempt. But now I knew why. And that knowledge burned inside me like acid, corroding any remnant of hope I might have had. I began to observe my mother with different eyes. I noticed the small scars on her arms, probably from struggling during the attack. I saw how she flinched when unknown men passed too close on the street. I noticed the medications she took to sleep, to ward off nightmares that surely still tormented her. For the first time, I felt something close to compassion for her. I understood that her emotional abandonment wasn't just cruelty, it was survival. The only way she found to continue existing with the constant reminder of her trauma living under the same roof. But this compassion mixed with an increasing anger. Anger because she hadn't been strong enough to separate the crime from the child. Anger because she had kept me only to punish me for a crime I didn't commit. Anger because she never sought help, never tried to heal her wounds so she could be a real mother. And then came that night. I was 16 and a half. Uncle Richard was more drunk than usual. It was the anniversary of my grandmother's death, and they always drank a lot on that day. My mother had gone to bed early after taking her medications. I was in my corner, as always, trying to be invisible. Richard started talking about the past, about how life had been before that night, before everything collapsed. Philip tried to silence him, but he was too drunk to listen. "You know why we're here, kid?" He turned to me, his eyes red and unfocused. "Because we're the only ones left to take care of her after what those animals did. And you're the damn living reminder of the worst day of her life." I remained silent, but for the first time, I held his gaze. This seemed to infuriate him even more. "Want to know the whole truth? Want to know why she hates you so much?" he continued, ignoring Philip's weak protests. "Because you're not just any rapist's son. You're the son of the man she knew, her boss's son at the time. She trusted him, and he invited her to a party. And there, he and his friends..." Uncle Philip finally managed to silence him with a punch. The two started fighting, knocking over furniture, breaking what little we had. I just stood there paralyzed as the final truth fell on me like a ton of concrete. My father wasn't just an anonymous aggressor. He was someone my mother knew, someone she trusted, and that made everything even worse. I left the house and walked aimlessly through the night. The city slept, indifferent to the storm forming inside me. The final pieces of the puzzle fit together. My mother's silence wasn't just from trauma, it was from shame, from betrayal. And her eyes didn't just see the face of any aggressor in me. They saw the face of someone she had known, perhaps even liked before he revealed the monstrosity he carried within. Something crystallized inside me that night. A plan began to form. If I was the son of monsters, if I carried that blood inside me, then maybe it was time to embrace that legacy. Not to repeat their crimes, never that, but to do justice, to end the cycle of pain once and for all. I spent the following months researching obsessively. I wanted to know who he was, the boss's son. I wanted a name, a face. I wanted to find him, confront him, make him pay for what he had done to my mother, for what he had done to me. I discovered that my mother had worked as a domestic employee for the Mendoza family before my birth. The boss's son, Edward Mendoza, was 25 at the time. I found pictures of him on the internet, and what I saw left me frozen. It was like looking at an older version of myself. The same eyes, the same face shape, even the same way of smiling in photos. It was undeniable. I was his son. Edward Mendoza was now a successful businessman, married with children. A perfect life built on my mother's suffering, on my cursed existence. The anger I felt was beyond anything I had ever experienced. I began to plan how to find him, how to confront him. I fantasized about making him suffer, about destroying his perfect life, as he had destroyed my mother's. But the more I sank into this hatred, the more I realized a terrible truth. I was becoming like him, letting violence consume me, letting hatred define who I was. And that's when I realized there was another way to break the cycle, a more definitive way. In the days that followed, I became almost kind at home. I did small chores, tried to start conversations with my mother. She seemed confused by the change, but still distant. The uncles were suspicious, especially Richard, who seemed to regret what he had revealed that night of drunkenness. I smiled and kept trying, not because I expected a miraculous reconciliation, but because I was saying goodbye, because I had made my decision. The plan took shape slowly, like crystals forming in still water. Each detail carefully considered, each consequence accepted. I knew what I needed to do to end the cycle of pain once and for all. And then, on the eve of my 17th birthday, I put my plan into action. That morning began like any other. I woke up early, before everyone in the house. I sat at the kitchen table and waited. It was a Saturday, so my mother wouldn't go to work. My uncles would probably spend the day drinking, as they did most weekends. The decision had been made for weeks. I had planned every detail meticulously. I had even written a letter explaining everything that I left hidden at the bottom of my backpack. I wanted people to understand why I did what I did, even if they didn't agree. My mother was the first to appear in the kitchen. She was wearing that old faded robe she never took off on Saturday mornings. Her hair, already with many gray strands despite being only 38 years old, was disheveled. She glanced at me, that quick look she always gave, as if seeing me for too long was too painful. "Good morning," I said, something I rarely did. She mumbled something in response, moving to make coffee. Her hands trembled slightly. Side effect of the medications she took to sleep. "It's my birthday tomorrow," I commented, keeping my voice neutral. She froze for a second. I realized she had forgotten, or maybe she was just surprised that I mentioned it. "I know," she lied, returning to busy herself with the coffee. 17 years, I continued. Almost an adult. She didn't answer. The heavy, familiar silence settled between us again. "You know that I know, right?" I finally asked. "About my father, about what happened." The cup she was holding fell to the floor, breaking into pieces. Hot coffee spreading over the cheap ceramic floor. She didn't move to clean it up. She just stood there, her back to me, her shoulders tense. "Richard told me," I continued, "when he was drunk, a few months ago." Slowly she turned to face me. For the first time in years, she really looked at me. Her eyes, so similar to mine in color, but so different in expression, were full of something I couldn't identify. Fear, shame, anger. "I don't want to talk about this," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I need to talk," I insisted. "I need to understand." "Understand what?" she responded, a thread of anger penetrating her usual apathy. "What is there to understand? It was the worst night of my life, and you are the constant reminder." I completed it for her. The son of him. She looked away, that familiar inability to face me returning with full force. "Why did you keep me?" I asked the question that had tormented me since I discovered the truth. "Why didn't you abort or give me up for adoption? Why keep me only to hate me?" "I don't hate you," she said so low I almost didn't hear. "No?" I laughed humorlessly. "You never hugged me, never said you loved me, never even managed to look at me for more than 2 seconds? What do you call that if not hate?" "I call it survival," she exploded, her voice louder than I had ever heard. "You think it was easy to look at you and see his face? Feel that night coming back every time you smile because the smile is just like his? I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. It was exactly what I suspected, but hearing her admit it was different, more real, more painful. So why keep me? I insisted. Because you weren't to blame, she said, tears now running down her pale face. Because somewhere inside me I knew you were innocent, that you didn't ask to be born like this, that you were also a victim. Her words should have comforted me, should have been what I always wanted to hear. But after 17 years of silence and rejection, they sounded empty. Too late. A victim you punished every day of my life, I responded, my voice strangely calm. I heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. My uncles were waking up. Soon they would be in the kitchen, and the moment of honesty would be interrupted. We would return to the familiar pattern of silence and avoidance. I found him, I said quickly. Edward Mendoza. I know where he lives. I know about his perfect family, about the perfect life he built after destroying yours. My mother paled even more, grabbing the edge of the sink as if she might fall. How? It wasn't difficult. You kept an old newspaper clipping, a report about the Mendoza family. I found it when I was looking for documents for school years ago. I didn't understand at the time. Now I do. My uncles entered the kitchen at that moment. Richard, still hungover from the night before, cast a suspicious look at the scene. My mother crying, me sitting calmly at the table, cup shards on the floor. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone immediately aggressive. "We're having a family conversation," I replied, without taking my eyes off my mother. About my father. The silence that followed was deafening. Philip cursed softly. Richard took a step in my direction, fists clenched. "You little piece of shit, what do you think you're doing?" "Trying to understand why I've been punished all my life for a crime I didn't commit," I replied, still calm. "Why you all look at me as if I were a monster when the real monsters are out there living their lives as if nothing happened." "You don't know anything," Richard spat the words. "You don't know what your mother went through, what we all went through." "I know more than you think," I retorted. "I know you two were there that night not to help, but to try to extort money from the Mendoza family. I know that you only stayed around out of guilt, not out of love." This was a bluff based on small fragments of conversations I had overheard over the years. But by the way they both paled, I realized I had hit the mark. "You want to know why we look at you like that?" Philip spoke, his voice trembling with anger. "Because you're just like him, not just in appearance, in manner, in coldness, in lies. It's as if he passed more than just DNA to you." His words hit me like a knife. It was my greatest fear, my worst nightmare to be like him, to carry not just his genes, but his evil. "I'm not like him," I said more to myself than to them. "No?" Richard laughed, a bitter sound. "Look at how you are now. Calculating, manipulative, playing with people's emotions exactly as he did." I felt something break inside me. A last thread of hope, perhaps. The idea that I could be different, that I could overcome the blood that ran in my veins. "Get out!" My mother spoke suddenly, her voice low but firm. "Richard, Philip, get out! I need to talk to my son." Son? She had never called me that before. Always the boy, him, as if saying my son was too painful. My uncles protested, but she insisted. Reluctantly, they left the kitchen. Not before Richard gave me a look that promised retaliation later. When we were alone again, my mother approached the table. She didn't sit down, but she stood close enough for me to see the tremor in her hands, the years of pain etched in the lines of her face. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "With this information about him?" I hesitated. The original plan was to confront him, make him pay somehow. But now I wasn't so sure anymore. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Part of me wants him to suffer like he made us suffer. Another part..." I stopped, unable to put into words the whirlwind of emotions I felt. "Another part just wants the pain to stop, for this whole cycle to end." Something changed in her eyes, an understanding perhaps, or fear. "Matthew," she said, using my name. something so rare it sounded strange coming from her. "What are you planning?" I didn't answer. I couldn't formulate in words what was going through my head. It was more of a feeling than a concrete plan at that moment, a certainty that something needed to end. "Don't do anything stupid," she continued, her voice gaining urgency. "He's not worth it. None of this is worth it." "Is it worth it to you?" I asked. "All these years of suffering, of looking at me and only seeing him, wouldn't it be better if—" "If what?" she asked when I didn't complete the sentence. I got up from the table. "I'm going for a walk. I need to think." She tried to stop me, grabbing my arm with a strength I didn't know she had. "Don't go after him, Matthew, please. That will only make everything worse." I looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time, I saw beyond the cold, distant woman who raised me. I saw a broken, traumatized woman who never had the chance to heal, who never had the resources or support to deal with what happened to her, who did the best she could, even if her best was terribly inadequate. "I won't go after him," I promised. And it was true. My plan had changed. I left the house and walked through the city for hours. The idea that had begun to form in my mind was terrible, but it also seemed inevitable, like the logical conclusion of a complex equation. If I was the constant source of my mother's pain, the living reminder of the worst moment of her life, and my uncles were right, and I carried not just the appearance, but something of the essence of that man. If there was no future for me beyond being seen as the monster's son, then perhaps the only solution was to remove all elements from the equation. I returned home late in the afternoon. The atmosphere was tense, charged. My uncles were in the living room drinking beer in silence. My mother wasn't in sight. "Where is she?" I asked. "In the bedroom," Richard answered dryly. "Took sleeping pills. She's wrecked after the scene you made." I nodded and went to the kitchen. I opened the drawer where the utensils were kept. The large knife we used to cut meat was there. I took it and felt its weight in my hand. I don't know how long I stood there contemplating the blade. Minutes. Hours. It seemed that time had stopped. "What are you doing?" Philip's voice startled me. He was standing at the kitchen door, looking at the knife in my hand. His face showed a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Nothing," I replied, putting the knife back in the drawer. "Just thinking." He didn't believe me, of course. He called Richard, and soon both were in the kitchen surrounding me. "I saw how you were looking at that knife," Philip said. "What are you planning, kid?" "Nothing that's any of your business," I replied, trying to get past them. Richard blocked my way. "You're not going anywhere until you explain what's happening." "Get out of my way," I said through gritted teeth. "Or what?" he provoked, pushing my shoulder. "Going to stab us? Prove you're just like your father." That was like a trigger. All the anger, all the pain, all the hatred I had accumulated over the years exploded inside me. I don't exactly remember what happened in the seconds that followed. I only remember grabbing the knife again and lunging forward. Richard was bigger and stronger, but he was drunk and slow. The knife entered his stomach with frightening ease. His eyes widened in shock, more surprise than pain. He staggered backward, knocking over chairs. Philip shouted and tried to subdue me. We fought. The knife cut through the air, finding flesh several times. Blood sprayed on the walls, on the floor, on me. The noise woke my mother. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, eyes wide with horror. The scene before her, her brothers bleeding, her son holding a bloody knife. "Matthew," she whispered, her face a mask of terror and incomprehension. "What have you done?" There was no going back, no explanation that made sense. At that moment, I had become exactly what they had always feared. The monster's son. The monster. I advanced toward her, not with anger, not with hatred, but with a strange feeling of finality, as if I were completing an inevitable task. "I'm sorry," I murmured as the blade found her body. "I'm sorry for who I am." Her eyes, fixed on mine at the moment life left them, showed no fear or anger, but understanding, as if in the end she understood what I was doing, as if in some perverse way it was a relief. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence I had never experienced before. not the silence charged with tension that permeated our home. An empty, final silence. I sat on the kitchen floor, in the midst of my family's blood, and waited. I didn't try to escape, didn't try to hide. I knew it was the end. I called the police and told them what I had done. When the sirens approached, a strange calm enveloped me. The cycle was broken. The pain had ended. Not in the way any rational person would have chosen, but in the only way my disturbed and desperate mind could find. The police found me still sitting there, covered in blood, the knife on the floor beside me. I didn't resist when they handcuffed me. I didn't say anything beyond what was necessary. I was taken directly to the police station, then to a juvenile detention center. The following weeks were a blur of interrogations, psychological evaluations, hearings. I confessed everything. I didn't try to justify or diminish what I had done. I knew there was no possible justification for taking 3 lives. I knew I deserved punishment. The judge, taking into account my age and circumstances, my history of neglect, the trauma of discovering the truth about my birth, sentenced me to 2 years in a juvenile rehabilitation center with mandatory psychiatric monitoring, a light sentence for such a serious crime. Many would say I didn't face justice, that I got off easy. Maybe they're right. In the 2 years I spent institutionalized, I thought a lot about the cycle of violence I had tried to break, only to perpetuate it in the worst possible way. About how I became exactly what I most feared, someone capable of causing pain, of taking lives, of destroying. I thought about Edward Mendoza, my biological father, whom I never confronted, who probably never knew of my existence, who continues living his perfect life, unaware of the suffering he caused, of the tragedy he set in motion. And I thought about my mother, how despite everything, she tried to give me a life, how in her broken and insufficient way, she tried to do the right thing, how I, in the end, was unable to see beyond my own pain to understand the depth of hers. When I was in the rehabilitation center, I met for the first time people who actually cared about what I felt. Psychologists, social workers, even some of the other incarcerated youth, people who didn't look at me and see only the monster or the monster's son. At first, I refused to speak during therapy sessions. I would sit in silence, as I had done my entire life at home. The psychologist, Dr. Lewis, was patient, would wait, wouldn't pressure me. "When you're ready, Matthew," she would say. "I'm here to listen." After almost 3 months of silence, I finally began to talk. I told her everything about growing up invisible, about the suffocating silence, about discovering the truth of my birth, about the hatred that grew inside me, consuming any possibility of compassion or forgiveness. Dr. Lewis helped me understand that while my pain was real and valid, my actions had no justification, that there were other ways out that I couldn't see at the time, blinded by trauma and desperation. "You were a child raised in trauma," she told me once. "A child who never learned healthy ways to process feelings, who never had adequate role models for behavior. That doesn't justify what you did, but it helps understand how you got to that point." During those 2 years, I learned more about my mother through police investigations. I discovered that she had once tried to seek therapy right after my birth, that she had quit after a few sessions because she didn't have money to continue, that there were letters in her room, letters she wrote to me but never delivered, where she expressed her conflict, her desire to love me, her inability to separate the child from the trauma. I discovered that my uncles had indeed tried to extort the Mendoza family after my mother's attack, that they were imprisoned for it, and that when they got out of jail, they returned to take care of her and me out of a mixture of guilt and family obligation. That their alcoholism worsened over the years, fueled by resentment and frustration. The more I learned, the more complex the story became. Less black and white, more filled with shades of gray, with nuances, with human flaws rather than one-dimensional monsters. This didn't bring my family back, didn't erase what I did, but it helped me begin to process, to understand, to find some kind of path forward, however difficult and painful it might be. I received letters during my incarceration, some supportive from people who had read about my case and felt compassion, others hateful, calling me a monster, a murderer. I read them all. kept some, tried to learn from each one. One letter in particular affected me deeply. It was from a woman who had been raped like my mother and who had also become pregnant. But unlike my mother, she managed to separate the trauma from the child. She managed to love the baby that was born. She wrote about the daily struggle, about the difficult moments, about how it wasn't easy, but also about how it was possible. That letter made me cry for the first time since the crime. Cry for what could have been, for what never was, for the mother my mother couldn't be, for the family we never had. When I turned 19, I was released from the center. I returned to the same city, but not to the same neighborhood. I couldn't face the looks, the whispers, the recognition. I got a job as an assistant in an auto repair shop on the outskirts of town. The owner, Mr. Paul, knew about my past. He was one of the few willing to give me a chance. Everyone deserves the opportunity to start over, he told me on the first day. What matters is what you do from here on out. I rented a small apartment near the shop. A simple place, but mine. The first truly mine space in my entire life. I continued with therapy, now at a community health center. It wasn't the same as with Dr. Lewis, but it was better than nothing. Sometimes I think about looking for Edward Mendoza, not for revenge, not for confrontation, just to see his face, to better understand this part of my origin, to perhaps separate in my mind the genes I inherited from him from the choices I made, to make sure I'm not destined to be like him. But I don't know if I'll ever have the courage or if it would be the right thing to do. In my new apartment, I have a small altar. I'm not religious, never have been. But on this altar is a photo of my mother, the only one I managed to recover. A photo from before, from when she was young, before violence transformed her. In this photo, she smiles, a smile I never saw in life. Every day I look at this photo and ask for forgiveness. I don't know if she can hear me, I don't know if there's something after this, but I need to believe that somehow, somewhere, she's at peace now, free from pain, from trauma, from the constant reminder. And I try to live a life that honors not what she became, but what she could have been if the world had been different, if there had been help, understanding, resources, if the cycle of violence had been broken before it reached me. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'll ever truly be able to forgive myself or if I deserve forgiveness. I don't know if people who cross my path would see beyond my crime if they knew the truth, if they could see the broken human and not just the monster. What I do know is that I'm trying, day after day. I'm truly trying to break the cycle, not through violence, but through understanding, compassion, forgiveness, not necessarily for myself, but for all trapped in this web of trauma and pain. I know I can never bring my family back. I know what I did is unforgivable, but I also know that the story doesn't end with me, doesn't end with my crime, that I can choose each day to be more than my genes, more than my past, more than my worst moment. It's a daily struggle. There are days when I wake up and feel the crushing weight of guilt, when I can barely look at myself in the mirror. Days when the silence in my apartment echoes the silence of my childhood home, and I have to turn on the radio, the TV, anything to not get lost in the memories. But there are also days of small victories, days when I can help someone at the shop and receive a smile in return. Days when therapy brings a new understanding, a new tool to deal with the past. Days when, for a moment, I feel that maybe, just maybe, my life can have some meaning beyond tragedy. I don't know if this is redemption. Probably not. I don't think there is redemption for what I did. But maybe it's something, a beginning, a small step toward being someone different from what everyone always expected me to be. If you've made it this far and understood what I've been through, I ask you to like this video now, subscribe to the Traumatic Accounts channel, hit the notification bell, and comment what time it is where you are right now. This helps me know I'm not alone, that my story, however difficult it may be, has touched someone, that it might serve as a warning, a lesson, a reflection for other people trapped in similar cycles of trauma and violence. I'm not here to ask for sympathy. I don't deserve that. I'm here to offer my story as a dark mirror to society, to show how untreated trauma propagates, how violence breeds violence, how silence can be as destructive as physical blows. And maybe, just maybe, to show that even in the darkest stories, there is room for something beyond darkness. Not necessarily light, not necessarily redemption, but something. A breath, a possibility, a different path. My name is Matthew. I'm 19 years old. I'm a murderer. I'm a survivor. I'm the son of violence, and every day I fight to be something more.